My name is Preeti Chauhan. I am the director of the Data Collaborative for Justice. And I'll tell you, my work in this area really started with the people behind the data. So when I was training as a clinical psychologist, I worked with girls and young women in detention centers, and then after detention centers when they were released, both clinically and with research. And one of the things that I noticed consistently was that all of these girls had very difficult backgrounds, abuse, trauma, but consistently, especially when I was going out into their neighborhoods after they were released, I noted that the girls of color were particularly disadvantaged. Their context was so that it seemed like their re-entry into the system was inevitable, and I just became really interested in understanding racial disparities and how to sort of create a fairer justice system. So 10 years ago, when I got the opportunity to join a college and a school that has a mission of social justice, I just couldn't have been more excited because it was in line with what I wanted to do with my own research. And a few years after I came back here, this name that you keep hearing over and over and over again, Jeremy Travis, who was the then president of John Jay, had this idea. He invited me and he said, you know, we should do something around misdemeanors. There's a lot of focus on felony crimes and serious crimes. At the time in New York, there was also a lot of focus and through advocacy and legislation, data around stop, question, and frisk. But what about all of these other really high volume activities, misdemeanors, summonses? We don't really know a whole lot about them. So fortunately, through funding from the Arnold Foundation, we created a series of reports and data access where we produced who's coming in contact with the system for these lower level offenses, what they're coming in contact with it for, how it's changed over time, and what are the outcomes of these very high volume activities. And we've been really fortunate in that our work has had impact. So the reports are great, but what we really care about is the impact. And some of the impact has been our data on summonses has been used to inform citywide legislation on the Criminal Justice Reform Act. Our most recent report on marijuana enforcement was used by New York State legislators and was cited, the data around race disparities was cited as a basis for decriminalizing marijuana possession enforcement. And luckily, some of our successes early on led us to get some additional funding to create what we call the Research Network on Misdemeanor Justice. And this is 6 other jurisdictions carrying out the same type of work we do. I should note what makes us very unique is that we're policy neutral. We don't make policy recommendations, but we do want our data, similar to what Jeff said, be very accessible and to make sure critical decision makers see this data to inform their thinking and their knowledge about what's happening in the system. So going forward, just to say a few things on what we'd like to do. So the research network is going to undertake some analyses on jails. So there's a lot of work done around prisons, but the work on jails is relatively new. It's picking up, but we certainly need more. And we know jails are expensive. More people touch jails than prisons, and even a day in jail can be very disruptive to an individual. So we're undertaking analyses to look at drivers of the jail population in the coming months. And also we will be examining, as most people in this room know, the 2020 reforms that are going to be implemented in New York City are going to be huge. And the nation's going to be looking at us to see how this sort of experiment works out with all the different reforms that we're implementing. So we will be examining data both to make sure that the reforms are having their intended consequences, but also to make sure that 1 or 2 sensational or anecdotal stories don't divert from the intentions of the reform or even the potential negative consequences. So with that, I just invite you to follow us on a little plug for us, datacollaborativeforjustice.org, and follow us on Twitter. And I look forward to speaking to some of you afterwards.